evening, everyone. Welcome to our MPC online Bible study. My name is Matthew McGlade. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. And every Tuesday night we have our thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. And as I say every week, why not do this learning in a life group, in a small group? Maybe watch the video, discuss the questions in your group, and in that way we get much more out of our time together. Now we're continuing our Bible study series titled The Kingdom Story. And what we're doing is that we are taking you through a journey over these next few weeks, looking at the big story of the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation, all 66 books. And we're looking at the underlying theme of the story of the Bible, which is, I believe, is about the kingdom of God. And God is inviting us to be participants of his kingdom and to be part of their story. Now, you remember in the first week, we looked at the first part, the kingdom's expression in creation in Genesis 1 and 2. Then we looked at the kingdom's rebellion, a man as king, in Genesis 3 and 5. And last week, we started to look at the kingdom's salvage plan in Genesis, flood of faith, in Genesis 6 to 50. And we saw that things got so bad that God decided to destroy the earth with a flood. But he saved Noah and his family and two of every kind of animal. And the result was that Noah and his family stepped out of the ark into a new world. Just as God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so now God commands Noah, and he says that they be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. And so Noah and his descendants, Adam and his descendants failed to represent God, but now God is starting again through Noah and his descendants to represent God's kingdom throughout the earth. However, what happens next shows us that that is not going to happen, because the previous generation, although it was destroyed by the flood, and though the earth was renewed, as it were, as a result of the flood, the real issue had not yet been resolved, because as many of you have heard me say this before, the heart of the issue is the issue of the heart. The human heart has still been contaminated by Adam's sin. And so even though Noah and his sons, they had faith in God, there was still that tendency in the heart towards sin. And we see what happened next in the story of Genesis. Noah planted a vineyard, fermented some grapes, made some wine, drunk some wine, had too much, ended up getting drunk, lying naked on his bed. Now you remember that this is the same Noah who trusted God. This is the same Noah who believed God, and yet he got himself drunk. Now why was that? Because there's still a sin nature within him. Further, things even got worse. His son Ham saw his dad lying naked on the bed, and the Bible intimates that he looked at him in a perverted way. Sick, I know. And so what this shows is that a global flood still did nothing to change the condition of the human heart. The heart was still corrupted by sin. And so Noah even curses his son Ham as a result of that. And so Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, from these three sons came the three main people groups of the earth. Ham was the ancestor of the people of the Middle East and Africa. Shem was the ancestor of the people of the Middle East, India, and the Far East. And Japheth was the ancestor of those of the European descent. And from Noah's three sons, the peoples of the earth would scatter and spread throughout the earth. However, prior to that happening, rather than the descendants of Noah doing what God commanded them to fill the earth, to subdue the earth, rather they settled, Noah and his sons settled in a place called Shinar, which we know as modern-day Mesopotamia. And they decided to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens. The purpose of building this city was so that they said that let us do this, that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Now, this is nothing but sheer rebellion to God. It's complete rebellion to what God has commanded them to do. And it's the same old problem as we saw before. Right from the very beginning, it is the problem of pride. Let us make a name for ourselves. Let us reach to the heavens by our own strength and means. And you see, when you see cities or skyscrapers reaching to the heavens, it is all an example of pride. One city builds a bigger, more better skyscraper than the other one because we want to be seen to be better. And pride, as I mentioned, is thinking and acting independently of God. Now, this city that the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth built was a city called Babel, from which we get the word Babylon. And Babel was the first human attempt to try to get to God on man's own terms. In fact, it was the first example of organized religion. And actually, organized religion is just another form of human pride. It's just trying to get to God in our own strength, by my own ways, in our own means. And God will not have it. In fact, the Lord sees what is happening. And God says something really profound. If, as one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. That's quite a thing for God to say, isn't it? When there's unity, there's nothing that's impossible for the human race that it can't do. But because of this human pride, God gives the descendants of Babel the first, or the people of Babel, the first gift of tongues, and he confuses them with different languages. The result is that peoples break off into small people groups, and they spread across the earth with their own unique cultures, languages, and that's why we have the variety of people groups, tribes, languages. Ultimately, it stems from Babel, and actually, it probably comes as no surprise that when you do study the stories of these people groups, particularly the Aborigines or the Maoris or various Indian tribes, they all have a common story. They all have a story going back to the flood. The Chinese language tells the story of the flood right from the very beginning, and so it's been written in the human record of history. And this was God's judgment against human pride. There was only room in this universe for one God. We saw this earlier on in this series, don't we? That pride is the root issue. It started in Lucifer. Then we saw it, and then we saw it in Babel, and the story of the Tower of Babel. And where there is pride, God will oppose it. God will reject it. God will not have it at all. He opposes pride, because those of us, when we act in pride, we want to set up our own domain, our own kingdom that is not prepared to yield and submit to God's kingdom. And the pride is the root issue why we have sin and death and lawlessness and destruction in our world today. And so it seemed that after God had destroyed the earth with a flood, and Noah's descendants started to migrate and spread throughout the earth, it would seem that God's original plan of starting over again had failed, after that it hadn't worked. And you may wonder, well, why wouldn't God just start again? Why don't we not just destroy the earth again and do the same thing as he did before? But he won't, because God had promised that he would never flood the earth again. And so God is looking for a people who would be his representatives on earth, a people whose hearts are changed, a people who love God, who serve God, and who respond to God in faith. And we've seen so far in this season that God always responds to faith. We saw faith in Abel. He came to God in his terms by the way of the blood. We saw faith in Noah. Because when there is faith, we represent God the way that God wants us to represent him. Further, as well as that, we also need to keep in mind that from the very beginning, and we saw this in this earlier on in Genesis, that God promised that through the woman, a child would be born, a seed, a promised deliverer would come, who would crush the head of Satan. And so God is looking for someone through whom the promised seed will come. And he's looking for a people who will represent his name and his kingdom. And so God decides to start again. He's looking for one man who has faith in him. And through this man, he wants to bring a new race of people who will represent his kingdom on earth. And that man was a man called Abram, who lived in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. He was married to his wife Sarai, and they moved from Ur of the Chaldeans to a place called Haran. And when they arrived there, God revealed himself to himself to Abram, and the Lord told Abraham to leave the comfort of this world that he knew and go to the land that he would show him. And in doing so, God made 3 promises to Abram. The first promise was that to Abram, I'm going to give you many descendants. I'm going to make you a great nation, and many descendants will come from you. And that his descendants will be likened unto the stars of the sky or the grains of sand on the seashore. And because of this, God changed Abram's name from Abram, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. As well as that, God also promised his descendants land. He said, the land that you're standing on, which we now know today as modern Israel, I'm going to give to your descendants as their inheritance from the Nile all the way up to the Euphrates River. And I believe that God's promise still stands today. The other thing that God promised Abraham was that through his seed, through his offspring, all nations on earth would be blessed. So the Lord is indicating that somehow the promised deliverer that God promised all the way back in the garden would come through the life of Abraham and would be a blessing to the nations. Now, when Abraham heard this, it's really important to understand a really important truth, because I want to notice that how Abraham responded when God promised these things to him. The Bible says that Abraham believed the Lord and was credited to him as righteousness. Now we see here a really important truth for us to get hold of. How is the human race going to be made right before God? And it's going to be made right before God by believing and trusting in God. Now, what does it mean to be righteous? It means to be completely in a right standing relationship with God. It means to have a perfect moral character. And the word credited is sometimes a word that is used in the financial world. It may be, if someone is in debt, a generous creditor may give them money so they can come out of debt, and now they're into credit. And this picture shows what God does for each of our lives. We are morally bankrupt before God. We are in debt. We are in the red in our relationship with God. But because we believe in God, because we put our trust in God, God credits his righteousness to our moral bank account. So we move from being in the red to being in the black. On his own merit, Abraham was not righteous before God, but because he believed God, God credited righteousness to his moral bank account. Why? As I mentioned before, because he believed God. You see, belief in God is more than just a mere mental exercise. It is a heart response to God. If I said to you, do you believe in the chair, that you observe or you're sitting on? And you say, yes, I do believe in it. Well, you demonstrate your belief in it by sitting on it. You see it and you respond to it by doing something with that chair, and you demonstrate it by a faith action. That's how faith responds. We hear God, we believe God, and we respond in faith. We do what God requires and asks of us. And because Abraham believed God, he trusted God, he walked in obedience to God. And thus, he had a righteousness that came from faith. He had a righteousness that came from believing in what God had promised over his life. And so where Abraham fell short in his righteousness, God credited righteousness to his moral bank account. But his faith in God also allowed him to live a life of obedience to God. Now go back to those promises. God promised Abraham descendants, land, and the promised seed. The deliverer would come through him. But there's a problem. You see, God promised Abraham many descendants, but he didn't have a son. Both him and his wife were unable to have a child. And you need to know that when God tells you to do something, or when God makes a promise to you, very often God doesn't do something that is possible or ordinary. The promises of God in the natural are not possible to be fulfilled. God does the impossible and the extraordinary in our lives so that we learn to rely on his strength rather than on our own. And so as a result, Abraham, who was 100 years old, and his wife Sarai, who was 90 years old, they have a son and they name him Isaac. And this was the miracle child that they would have. But the greatest test for Abraham is yet to come. You see, when Isaac had grown up into a young man, the Lord instructs Abraham to take his son, his only son, and to offer him as a sacrifice to the Lord on a place called Mount Moriah. Now, Abraham at that time, in that part of the world at that time, it was quite common for various pagan practices for people to sacrifice their own children to the gods. And so Abraham knew what this was about, but it disturbed Abraham because he knew this God whom he was starting to worship, and he knew that this would be inconsistent with his character for God to command him to do this. And not only that, God had promised that it was through Isaac, his son, that many descendants would come and that the promised deliverer would come. And so Abraham wrestled with this in his heart. And the Bible says that Abraham sort of reckoned and figured in his heart that, well, God is telling me to do this, but he's promised that it's through Isaac that I'll be a blessing to the nations. So his logical conclusion was that, well, God must be able to raise him from the dead. And so the following morning, Abraham takes his son Isaac. He travels with his servants to Moriah. When they get to the foot of the mountain, him and his son go to Mount Moriah. He tells his servants that me and my son are going up to make a sacrifice, and we will return, which demonstrates that Abraham had faith that God would raise his son Isaac from the dead. And as they're making the way to Mount Moriah, Isaac says, Dad, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where is the sacrifice? Where is the lamb to sacrifice to the Lord? And Abraham says to his son Isaac, he says, Isaac, son, the Lord will provide. And then what Abraham does, he binds his son Isaac. And remember, Isaac would have been a young man at this stage. So Isaac voluntarily submits himself to the will of his father, and he ties him and he places him upon an altar. And I want you to imagine for a moment the immense strain that is in the heart of Abraham as he seeks to obey what God has told him to do. He takes his knife, he raises it above the head, and just as he's about to plunge it into his son, he hears a voice from heaven saying, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities and their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. And then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. You see, here's an amazing picture of what God is going to do in the future through one of Abraham's descendants. Abraham was in obedience, was about to sacrifice his only son Isaac, who was in order to die. Like all of us, all of humanity is in order to die, to pay for the penalty of our sin. And just as as he acts in faith, as he responds in faith to what God had instructed and told him to do, God provided a substitute in the form of a ram who would die in the place of his son Isaac. And so Abraham trusted in the Lord. He believed in God's love. And because he trusted in God, God provided a deliverer, a way of escape, a substitute on behalf of his son Isaac. And so this would serve as a picture of what God will do in the future in sending a promised deliverer, promised right from the very beginning in the book of Genesis to Abraham and his descendants, that through his descendants all nations of the earth will be blessed, that God will provide a deliverer who will be a substitute on our behalf. Well, Isaac grew up. Later on, he married Rebekah. He had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was a bit like Cain. He lived independently of God, did his own thing. But Jacob trusted God. Jacob was by no means innocent. He had a crafty nature that God had to deal with throughout his life. But sometime later, God changed Jacob's name from Jacob, deceiver, to being Israel, Prince of God. And Israel and Jacob throughout his life had 12 sons: Reuben, Levi, Simeon, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. And these descendants of Joseph would later become what we now know as the 12 tribes of Israel. But it was through one of these tribes, the tribe of Judah, that God's promised deliverer would come to the world. Jacob and his sons lived a nomadic life. They were shepherds. Like his father Isaac, Abraham had, like his father Isaac and Abraham, Jacob was also a shepherd, I should say. But over time, Jacob and his family and their sons moved from the land of Canaan to Egypt as a result of a famine. And during that time, they moved into the land as a small community of about 70 people. And for the next 400 years, Jacob, or Israel's descendants, would grow from being a people of just 70 descendants to over 2.5 million people in the land of Egypt. And so God is already beginning to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham, that he'll give him many descendants, as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. However, God's promise to give them land had not yet been fulfilled, because they still remained in the land of Egypt, and the promised deliverer, through whom God says, "I will bless all nations," still had not yet arrived through Abraham's descendants. And next week, we're going to see how God begins to fulfill that purpose through Israel, through the nation of Israel. I'm going to reveal how God uses the nation of Israel as his instrument to bring salvation to the earth. And that's what we're going to be looking at next week. Well, guys, that's our thought to think about. A question to ponder in our life groups is this. What was the key characteristic of Abraham's life that put him in a right standing relationship with God? And how did he show this quality in life? So what was the key characteristic of Abraham's life that put him in a right standing relationship with God? And how did he show this quality in life? And then also the text of study, I'd like you to read Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 19. How does Abraham's offering of Isaac serve as a picture of what Jesus has done? How does Abraham's offering of Isaac serve as a picture of what Jesus has done? Well, guys, hopefully you got something out of that. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the evening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. God bless you all.